I'm honored to receive the Sutherland Award, and I thank you for your kindness. 4 miles west of Boston, on the Cambridge-Watertown line, you will find Mount Auburn Cemetery, America's first landscaped burial ground and a spectacularly beautiful parkland. Before Mount Auburn was laid out in 1831, Americans interred one another as Europeans had done for 1,000 years, almost anonymously in graves topped with nearly identical slate stones lined up in crowded ranks. These graves were periodically recycled, emptied out to make room for new corpses. You can find an example of the old-style cemetery on Copp's Hill in Boston's North End, the earliest part of the city to be inhabited by colonists, where an ancient graveyard, founded in 1659, still survives. Slate stones remain, but many of them are broken or illegible. Most of these older cemeteries, established in the centers of what became thriving cities, have been destroyed, a destruction that has silenced their testimonies about the past. When Mount Auburn Cemetery opened in the early 1830s, it broke with the centuries-old approach to burial. Located on what was at the time a rural fringe of Boston, it kept the dead out of the population center, a step that, as city planners were realizing, was important to sanitation. Mount Auburn's landscaping, reflecting the romanticism of the era in which it was founded, was calculated to offer the consolations of nature to those visiting their dead. Tombs and monuments are scattered through bosky dells and around quiet ponds, at the foot of ancient trees, and in the shade of flowering shrubs. But Mount Auburn was designed for yet another purpose, the one of interest to me here, and that was to give Bostonians a sense of their own history. It was to be a place where they could commemorate their ancestors and civic heroes. Mount Auburn attempted to engineer civic memory. Its founders, anxious to create a sense of social stability in a city that had recently led a revolution, realized that Boston, and indeed the entire nation, needed traditions and a collective memory. The cemetery's establishment reflected their sense of history and desire to weave connections between the present and the past. It offered what one historian calls landscapes of memory. It seems to me that as criminologists, with regard to our own history, our circumstances much like that of Bostonians before they had the inspired idea of establishing Mount Auburn. We have little awareness of criminology's development and almost no monuments or touchstones that can help us recollect our past and establish a sense of tradition. Where we need words, we have silence. Where we need traditions, we have forgetfulness. Where we need reflexivity, we have ignorance. What we need is a history, or rather histories, of our science. To be sure, stimulating work has been produced by scholars such as Peter Becker and Richard Wetzel, David Garland, Piers Byrne, Mary Gibson, John Laub, Rob Sampson, and above all, Michel Foucault. But as John Laub remarked in his presidential address to the ASC, and I'm quoting, "The field of criminology lacks a sense of its own history. There is a presentism in our field that I find contrary to the spirit of a healthy, intellectually vibrant enterprise. Supposedly new developments in our field are constantly offered in an environment characterized by collective amnesia. We can rectify this by taking our past more seriously, so that we will be better able to create our future." End of quote. In what follows, I want to propose a specific historical framework that will enable us to take John's general advice and make it concrete. First, however, I want to ask why related disciplines, such as psychology and sociology, are so much richer than criminology in histories of their sciences. Is it because criminology is too new as an area of academic inquiry? Perhaps, although one might note that nearly a century or more has passed since criminology was first taught in England and the United States, and that over 130 years have passed since Lombroso founded the field. Or is our historical laggardness perhaps due, as some contend, to the fact that criminology is not really a discipline at all, but rather a field without a disciplinary core? Maybe, but the same charge of lacking a core could be brought against psychology, an area of inquiry on which historians have lavished considerable attention, despite its being all spokes and no hub, all branches with no trunk. Is the dearth of histories of criminology perhaps due to the relatively small size of the field? Maybe, but one could point to the richer history of even smaller fields. There are more histories of optics and ocular devices than of criminology. Or should we explain our silence about the past in terms of what Bob Bursick has termed a newness fetish, a mistaken belief that criminology has generated bodies of theory and research of steadily increasing quality and creativity over time? Bursick's explanation hits near the truth, I think, and it relates to the way in which many criminologists misunderstand the nature of science. Over time, criminologists have tended to adopt what one might call the gold-digging model of doing science, interpreting their work as a search for precious truth, for a definitive cause of crime, or at least an unshakable scientific step in that direction. If we dig deeply enough according to this model and work with sufficiently powerful tools, we will eventually hit pay dirt, at which point we can toss the fool's gold of earlier efforts in the trash. This belief probably stems from an impression that the hard sciences follow the gold-digging model, which is another misunderstanding. Whatever its explanation, criminologists' disdain for memory condemns us to operate with one hand, maybe two, tied behind our backs. We lack a sense of our work as a part of a project in time. Large chunks of our memory have fallen away, leaving us like victims of Alzheimer's disease, stripped of our identity. We have to function not only without a past, but also without a sense of criminology's possible futures. When we allow our past to atrophy and disappear, we lose track of who we are, where we come from, and where we are going. We become scientistic, pretending to resemble hard scientists, and we have to struggle along without the sustenance of traditions and without a sense of the field's identity. History, on the other hand, molds individual and collective identities. It can contribute to the sociology of criminological knowledge, for example, by illuminating the life course of theories of crime. It can disabuse us of myths about early criminologists on whom we might draw for support when, in fact, what we think we know of their work is mainly misinformation. History enables us to be reflexive, to modify what we do as a result of learning about the past. History can improve our understanding of social change in the field of criminology. It gives us a long view. Knowing our history teaches us not only where our ideas came from, but where we are going and who we are. History, like a cemetery that memorializes the past, is a civilizing influence. Laub has proposed a life course approach to criminology, identifying 3 eras from 1900 to the present, and within them 5 turning points or key shifts in criminology's intellectual trajectory. This proposal provides a framework for studying the development of 20th century American criminology, but it needs extension for 2 reasons. First, it starts in 1900 and focuses on the United States, but criminology is much older and geographically broader. If we define criminology as efforts to study crime and criminals scientifically, then we must recognize that the field began in the late 18th century in Europe and its colonies, as well as in the United States. Excuse me. Second, although Laub's analysis acknowledges the impact of external forces outside of the discipline, its turning points approach emphasizes internalist history built on changes within the field. But to understand the development of criminology, we need both internal and external analyses, and therefore an analytical framework that begins with intellectual movements and issues that had nothing directly to do with criminology. Criminology is developed within the framework or overall set of philosophical assumptions of scientific modernism. Scientific modernism has provided the intellectual foundation for criminology from the late 18th century into the present, setting its parameters and shaping its content. Like modernism more generally, it consists of ideas derived from Enlightenment thought. Scientific modernism incorporated positivism. It called for objectivity and neutrality, experimentation and verification, and it insisted that truth be determined by empirical evidence. It assumed that scientific knowledge is concerned with the general rather than the unique, and that the job of science should be to simplify, to find common elements. Its model of science, based on that of the natural sciences, implied that the social sciences would look for causes and to some degree be deterministic. In its application of science to daily life, scientific modernism called for practicality, efficiency, technical expertise, and social engineering. Within the overall framework of scientific modernism, criminology unfolded in 3 main stages. First came what I call exploratory modernism, a period that lasted from the 1780s until the 1870s, and during which researchers tried to figure out how to apply the principles of scientific modernism to the study of crime. Next came the lengthy period that we might term confident modernism, starting in the 1870s and lasting into the 1970s. During this century, modernism's scientific project realized itself in criminology as well as other social sciences. Third came the period of agonistic modernism. Starting about 1970 and continuing into the present, confidently modernist criminology lost its nerve, entering into an agon or serious struggle in which factions fought over the basic tenets of scientific modernism. The field experienced a splintering of its hitherto sturdy disciplinary model and challenges to its fundamental epistemological and scientific assumptions. You might wonder why I don't simply call this third period postmodernist criminology, since the phenomena of splintering, fragmentation, and recombination, not to mention that of epistemological upending, are characteristics of postmodernist theory. I don't because so few of those who caused the splintering and who became protagonists in the agon subscribed in any detail to the philosophical positions of postmodernist theory. Thus, agonistic modernism seems a better, if less chic, term. Let me now identify these three stages in more detail. During the first period of exploratory modernism, or you might want to call it proto-disciplinary criminology, researchers began to study crime and criminals using what they considered to be scientific methods. This was an exploratory period because researchers were scouting out new territory, prowling and probing without as yet having agreed on how to proceed. For example, phrenologists developed a biological and empirical, though not experimental, explanation for criminal behavior of all sorts. And in France, André-Michel Guéry compiled the first national database on crime, using arrests for a baseline. Guéry's compatriot Adolphe Quetelet recognized that the consistency shown by crime statistics year after year and independent of reactions by the criminal justice system meant that crime must be a social, not an individual phenomenon. Henry Mayhew conducted his monumental study of the prisons of London, speculating en route on the causes of crime, and Friedrich Engels began to develop a theory of urbanization and crime. However, these and other early investigators did not think of themselves as criminologists, nor did they conceive of their work as a contribution to a specific science of crime and criminals. They thought of themselves as physicians or lawyers or statisticians, contributing to medicine or law or the compilation of government statistics. Without realizing it, they were assembling tools and materials for confidently modernist criminology. But it was not until the 1870s the researchers realized that they might actually be creating the building blocks for a new field, a science of crime and criminals. During the period of confident modernism, researchers applied the principles of scientific modernism to understanding crime and criminals. This was a confident period because investigators fully expected that the methods of scientific modernism, if applied correctly, could identify the causes of crime. It began when, in the early 1870s, British physicians and psychiatrists began producing something that sounded very much like criminal anthropology, although they still had no independent name for such work, nor any clear idea of how it might be made scientific. The changeover to a fully confident modernist criminology had to wait until 1876, when Cesare Lombroso introduced his theory of criminal anthropology and demonstrated that the study of crime and criminals could be a science. From today's perspective, his positivism was crude, both epistemologically and methodologically. However, its very crudeness demonstrates not only that Lombroso, like others of his generation, was unsophisticated as a research scientist, but also that to develop scientific methods for the study of crime was really an exceedingly difficult task. In what ways was Lombroso's research scientific? What methods did he develop for studying criminals? In other words, in what ways did his work represent a move into confident modernism? First, Lombroso used numbers, looking to verify his claims through aggregations and generalizations such as recidivism rates. He measured skulls and reported his results in tables that broke down his results by offense type. He introduced control groups, comparing criminal man with the so-called healthy or law-abiding man and with the insane. He compared female to male criminals and all criminals to the African and Australian, quote, savages that he saw as evolutionary prototypes of the criminal. Drawing on the hard sciences model, Lombroso insisted on complete determinism, at least in the case of the anthropological criminal. In his view, the born criminal had no free will whatsoever, but rather was physically doomed to kill and steal. Quite apart from these specifics, Lombroso was a confident modernist simply by virtue of his insistence that criminal anthropology adopt scientific methods. We must abandon the sublime realms of philosophy, he wrote, and even the sensational facts of crime itself, and proceed instead to the direct physical and psychological study of the criminal, end quote. The iconoclastic nature of this statement becomes clearer if one notes that previously most criminological discussions had been based either on philosophical principles or horrific anecdotes. Today Lombroso's science seems careless, racist, and sexist, but there's no denying that he was doing something revolutionary, inventing a confidently modernist criminology. His achievement brought him respect as well as occasional ridicule throughout the Western world. A key transition within the period of confident modernism occurred around 1900, when researchers rejected criminal anthropology, but renewed their interest in the field that was now being called criminology. By about 1890, it had a name. Key figures in this transition included W.E.B. Du Bois, Emile Durkheim, Francis Keller, and Gabriel Tarde. Like their Lombrosian predecessors, this new generation of criminologists confidently embraced positivism, but they were far less deterministic. They had a clearer understanding of what scientific methods entailed, and they generated theories that were more sociological in cast. Their approach persists into the present. We are their heirs. However, these changes of about 1900, although deeply influential, fundamentally continued the trajectory initiated in the 1870s. The sociological positivists of the early 20th century, like their more naturalistic predecessors of the 1870s, did not question the power of science to solve criminological mysteries. They shared their predecessors' epistemological assumptions about the field's methods and mission. They too were confident in their modernism. Threats to confident modernism appeared around 1970, when criminology's scientific and epistemological assumptions were fractured by the advent of feminism, radical racial politics, the revival of Marxism, student revolutions, drug cultures, the entry into the academy of a generation of young liberals eager to challenge tradition. Such dramatic challenges naturally had many points of origin, but for convenience, we might peg them to 1968, when, in the British Journal of Sociology, the young feminist Frances Heidenson observed that, quote, "The deviance of women is one of the areas of human behavior most notably ignored in the sociological literature," end quote. An observation that led her to suggest, ever so politely, that criminologists' supposedly objective science was deeply contaminated by sexism. A few years later, in the book titled The New Criminology, a trio of British radicals invoked Marx to attack the political and epistemological underpinnings of traditional criminology. Black voices too joined the chorus. What they were all demanding was not the end of science, but better science, a criminology and criminal justice system shorn of social class, racial, and gender biases, of exclusionary practices, and of uncritical correctionalism. More recently, other new voices have inserted themselves into criminological discourse, including those of cultural criminologists and postmodernist criminologists. In sum, since about 1970, we have seen a breakdown of basic assumptions and the rise of self-reflexive standpoint criminologies, discourses self-consciously generated from specific viewpoints, such as that of critical criminology. However, aside from a few fully postmodernist works, these new criminologies have seldom been anti-science, nor have they even collectively replaced traditional confident criminology. Indeed, although they may have made some traditionalists uncomfortable, they have had little effect on business as usual. For example, despite the development of feminist criminology, many criminologists still do not grasp the difference between sex and gender. In sum, criminology has been going through a struggle or contest, an agon that has been anguishing at times, but fatal to none of the combatants. Traditionalists have continued generating theories and addressing social problems as usual without paying much attention to critiques of methodological positivism, even while new voices, fresh approaches, and strong critics have entered the field, fragmenting the old consensus. My proposed framework, its chronology and its labels, are necessarily tentative and speculative. Too little is known about the history of criminology to speak definitively. Moreover, it is clear that my framework applies better to some countries than others, and that other frameworks will need to be devised for nations beyond North America and Western Europe. It is also clear that historical periods do not simply drop dead on a given date, but rather taper off and intermingle with what follows. The reason I'm taking the trouble to propose this framework at all is to push the history of criminology into motion. My hope is to stimulate specific studies, for example, of the history of quantification in criminology. For another example, somebody could do a history of shifts in epistemological criteria for determining truth. I will have succeeded if people challenge my chronology with different periodizations and my labels with other terminology. One final point before returning to the graveyard. Most people define criminology as a social science, perhaps even as a subdivision of sociology. But I'm starting to think that social science is perhaps too narrow a category for criminology, at least if we want to do a history of a field that began with anthropology, biology, medicine, and psychiatry, and today is again ballooning outward toward biology, including genetics and neuroscience, and also toward cultural phenomena such as the media and crime. We could limit our ambitions to histories of criminology as a social science, but we might do better to nest the field among the human sciences, meaning all those disciplines concerned with the nature of human beings, including anthropology, biology, economics, philosophy, political theory, psychology, and sociology. Reclassifying criminology as a human science might annoy some sociologists, but it could lead to more inclusive and accurate histories of the field, not to mention a clearer understanding of what constitutes criminology today. Now to return to Mount Auburn Cemetery, which I used earlier as a metaphor for writing history, for getting to know our ancestors, and for maintaining our past. We don't need to sing hosannas to great forerunners, as did those at Mount Auburn who memorialized their ancestors with life-size angels and towering obelisks. That's the tomb of Mary Baker Eddy, and they say she's even got a telephone in there for when the resurrection comes, she'll be ready to get in contact. That's the most pretentious tomb in Mount Auburn. But we do need to find ways to break our silences, preserve our memories, and connect with earlier generations of criminologists. Remembering, as the philosopher Paul Ricoeur points out, is not only welcoming, receiving an image of the past, but also searching for it, doing something. Memory involves more than just passively having images of the past pop into our heads. It also involves the active process of recollection. We need to write chapters of our past equivalent to Mount Auburn's tombstones and grave markers in order to build collective memories and give criminology what other fields and disciplines already have, a past and sense of scholarly traditions. How is criminology to recover its past through writing histories? The problem needs to be addressed structurally. Faculties should start requiring courses in the history of criminology for both undergraduate majors and graduate students, and they should give annual prizes for the best historical papers. Journals such as Criminology need to make room for articles on the history of the field so that historical research is rewarded with publication. This enlargement would depend not only on editors making space, but also on reviewers reading such work with open minds. In this connection, let me mention 2 rejection letters that I received from reviewers of my own historical articles. The first reviewer advised the journal to publish only articles on experimental criminology. The second, reacting to my intellectual biography of the psychologist Hans Eysenck, asserted that no one should write about Eysenck, quote, until the resurrection. Such responses are hardly calculated to encourage historical research, and the responsibility falls on all of us to review historical research as though it mattered. We should also encourage historians to join our faculties, and criminologists should reach out collaboratively to historians of science. In other words, we need to create our own Mount Auburn. It won't be made of marble, for history is always changing, and each generation has to interpret it anew. But if we write our history, then future generations will have something to reinterpret, and the field will have a clearer sense of its own identity, where it has been, what it is, and where it is going. Thank you.